so much for that nice introduction and for suggesting the topic. The last time I was here, it might need to go up there. I have spoken before on sort of modern fairy tales, Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, and we've done certain of the ancient fairy tales as well, and what they reveal about what they contain in terms of the ancient wisdom, theosophy. You see, the ancient wisdom is often concealed. We read that all the time in theosophical texts, and there are a number of reasons why this is. I won't go into them, but most of them would be familiar to long-standing members of the society who understand the real meaning of the word occult. Peter Pan is perhaps not as full of the ancient wisdom as, say, The Wizard of Oz, which was written by a card-carrying theosophist, or Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, or Through the Looking Glass, which was written by a man who was not actually, to my knowledge, a card-carrying theosophist, but certainly had in his home library hundreds of books on the occult and the true meaning of that word, including theosophy and Rosicrucianism. James Barrie, as we'll see, was a rather sceptical sort of fellow who, perhaps to his credit, didn't have any real connection with formal religion, or if he did have some originally with the Free Presbyterian Church, but ultimately he moved away from that. He did have some things to say about religion. Some of them were positive. He was certainly a very spiritual man, though, amongst other things. So let's look at sort of the Peter Pan, The Two Worlds, which is the title of this talk. Most of us will be familiar who've studied any sort of spiritual, particularly esoteric literature, listened to any talks, that there is a visible world and an invisible one. There's what we call, perhaps erroneously, the real world. That means this thing here, which actually, in true esotericism and occult literature, is not the real world. But anyway, the so-called, I call it the so-called real world, and the world of fantasy. There's the world of the flesh and the world of the spirit. The world of reason and worldly values and the world of the imagination. There's a so-called, and I use that word so-called again, ordinary world and the magical world. The world of adults and the world of children and childhood. And we ask ourselves, which is the real world? Are they both real? Is neither of them real? Or are those two worlds that I described in various metaphors the same world? Or if they are two worlds, do they interpenetrate each other? Here's a quote from the novel Peter Pan by James M. Barrie, whom we'll have a bit to say shortly. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up. This is the beginning of the end. That's the opening line of Peter Pan, which, by the way, was a play and a novel, and has been made into a musical play on Broadway and elsewhere. Various cinematic and television versions of it, like Alice in Wonderland. It seems one of those perennial things. When you get I think John Algeo said, when you get a story like that goes through so many incarnations and is popular universally over time, you're dealing with something mythic, which doesn't mean unreal. You know what it means. One of J.M. Barrie's, Sir James Barrie, he was later, one of his biographers said, all of James Barrie's life and writings led up to the creation of Peter Pan. He was Scottish, J.M. Barrie, born the 9th of May 1860, died the 19th of June 1937. When people think of James M. Barrie, if they think of him at all, they think of him as the man who wrote Peter Pan, which, by the way, was, in a sense, the Harry Potter of the 1900s. Well, let's, to use a phrase from Alice in Wonderland, begin at the beginning and proceed to the end and then stop. Only we'll do it rather briefly, in a truncated fashion. From childhood, J.M. Barrie's interest was in creating stories and plays. And you find this true of so many writers. After graduating from college, he moved to London to pursue a career as a writer. And soon his work, various writings, began to be published. In the 1880s, his novels about a wandering little girl, his own mother, captured the public's imagination and put him on the road to fame and wealth. He soon became one of Great Britain's, not just England's, most famous writers. Despite his professional success, in his personal life, he had a lot of problems. He was gawky, he was painfully shy with women. The thought of marriage absolutely terrified him for whatever reason. In one of his journals, after a nightmare, he wrote, "Greatest horror, dream I am married, wake up screaming." Some of us might think that after the event, but he wasn't even married then. But he did eventually marry a lovely young lass, Mary Ansell, who was one of the leading ladies. She was an actress. One of the leading ladies in one of his plays. He wrote plays, all sorts of things. She was more of a mother to him than a spouse or a wife. Mother-like, she nursed him through a life-threatening bout of pneumonia. And when he recovered, they decided to marry. It was a disaster right from the start. It seemed Barrie wasn't capable of an intimate relationship with anybody, male or female. He was probably impotent as well, and that's sometimes a problem in marriages. Sometimes. He was stuck physically and emotionally in a state of perpetual boyhood. Shades of Peter Pan. We'll talk later about on whom did he base the character of Peter Pan, and there's no clear consensus on that. It seems a number of people came together, even by his own admission, but very much it was based on himself. Eventually Mary kind of got a bit jaded with J.M. Barrie and fell in love with another man, Gilbert Cannon. She demanded a divorce, but for whatever reason Barrie first of all refused. His marriage had given him the appearance of being normal. Remember, in those days, if you weren't married, there was something very wrong. Mary threatened to tell the world that he was impotent and that it had never consummated their marriage, which is true. It was never consummated, apparently. It wasn't there at the time, but it's well written that it wasn't. She said later about her husband, after they were divorced, love in its fullest sense could never be felt by him or experienced. Eventually he gave in and granted a divorce, and they were divorced in 1909. Barrie basically retreated into his writing, and he was very successful at that. One day, while he was in London's Kensington Gardens, the year was 1897, he befriended 5 young boys, in a nice way it seems. 5 young boys, the Llewellyn Davies boys. 5-year-old George, his younger brothers Jack and Peter. Later came Michael and Nicholas, who was nicknamed Nico. Meeting the 5 young brothers reignited Barrie's own desire to, I think the only word for it is regress, into childhood, and inspired him to create the legendary character of Peter Pan, although some of it was based on himself, some of it was based on the Greek mythological god Pan. Some of it was based on the character of Peter Pan. Some of it was based on Barrie's own brother, who had met an untimely early death. Anyway, the Llewellyn Davies boys' father, Arthur, he was a lawyer, and like many lawyers and professionals, he spent more time at the office than with the family. Barrie somehow jumped in to fulfill some of the role of a parent. The mother, Sylvia, was rather sickly. Barrie would play with the Davies boys. He was a frequent caller at their home. He even rented a cottage nearby when they were on vacation in Surrey. He idolised the boys' mother, Sylvia. But it was with the children that he felt that he could truly be himself, childlike. He met them daily in the park or at home. They played Indians together in the days when it wasn't politically incorrect to talk about cowboys and Indians. I remember that era. The thing I wanted most at the age of 6, 7, 8 was, to get a toy gun or an Indian outfit or a cowboy outfit. Some of my happiest memories, but these days all that's a no-no. Barrie and the boys pretended to be pirates, and each would force the others to walk the plank. He made up stories for the boys, just as the author of The Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum, used to every night have the neighbour kids in and would make up stories, fairy tale stories for the kids. Barrie would even act out these fairy tales involving birds and fairies. It seemed he became quite indispensable to the Llewellyn Davies boys, a playful companion, and in some ways a surrogate father. He even helped the family financially when the father was struggling, and what happened too, the father, Arthur, died quite early of cancer of the jaw. Barrie helped to send the boys to Eton, quite exclusive public, that means private school, over here. As the sons grew older, his interests wandered from one to the other. First George was the favourite, then young Michael. Sylvia died at the age of 44, also of cancer, that's the mother. And on Sylvia's death, Barrie became legally the boys' guardian. A fair bit of tragedy occurred, though, to these boys. None of them, except possibly one, had a happy ending to their lives. We'll talk about this in a minute. George died on the Western Front during World War I. After the war, Michael, another one of the Llewellyn Davies boys, who was actually Barrie's intended model for the statue of Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. Who's seen that statue? Yeah, I have, yes. He drowned clasping a fellow undergraduate, another lost boy it seems, in a pool near Oxford in 1921. We don't really know today whether it was a tragic bathing accident or a suicide pact. It was never properly established whether Rupert, the other young man, died trying to in vain to rescue Michael, or whether they chose an awfully big adventure in the afterlife. Even Barrie wrote once, "To die will be an awfully big adventure." It's actually in Peter Pan, those lines. Barrie never recovered from Michael's death, the one who drowned. And what of the other boys? Peter committed suicide as recently as 1960, comparatively. He died beneath the wheels of a train because he could no longer stand all the attention Peter Pan had unwillingly heaped upon him. Another, one of the boys, Jack, suffered all his life from depression, but I think died naturally. Only 2 of the 5 brothers whom Barrie had loved lived their natural span, and only Nicholas, the youngest, Nico, seemed to have emerged relatively unscathed and with an untarnished view of Barrie. D.H. Lawrence, the great writer, was moved to say, J.M. Barrie has a fatal touch for those he loves. Perhaps a bit unfair, but there you go. Now, what motivated Barrie in his interest in these boys? Was it pedophilia? Shades of Lewis Carroll. I dealt with that issue before when I spoke of Alice in Wonderland. But there's no clear, in my view, demonstrable, probative evidence that Carroll was a pedophile. What about J.M. Barrie? Again, there doesn't seem to be any clear-cut evidence on the matter, or any evidence that he was a pedophile. One of the boys themselves, Nicholas, said this: "I lived with him on and off for more than 20 years. That's Barrie he's talking about. Alone with him in his flat for 5 of those years, and I never saw any glimmer of anything approaching homosexuality or pedophilia. He was an innocent, which was why he could write Peter Pan." I'd like to think that's the true position. Moving on. One thing is clear, unambiguously clear, out of his friendship with the Llewellyn Davies family, and the boys in particular, emerged Barrie's various versions or incarnations of Peter Pan, as a play, as a novel. Barrie himself said this about the origins of the character of Peter Pan: "I made Peter Pan by rubbing the five of you," he actually said this to the boys, "the five of you, the Llewellyn Davies boys, together, as savages with two sticks produce a flame." He actually wrote that on the dedication page of the printed version of the play Peter Pan, not the novel. It's in print. But as I said, there's some evidence that it could have also been based on Barrie's older brother David, who had died in some unfortunate circumstances. He died in an ice skating accident just before on the day before his 14th birthday. Some have suggested that Pan, Greek mythological character Pan, the god of the wild, shepherds and flocks and rustic music, companion of the nymphs. Who knows? I won't go into the story of Peter Pan, but I want to just focus on some of the characters and their relationship to real people. It seems that every story has some secret land of enchantment. The Wizard of Oz has the Land of Oz and the Emerald City there. Peter Pan has a place called Neverland. There was a film by that name too, Johnny Depp film. Alice in Wonderland, or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the correct title, the full title. Wonderland. Although in some translations it comes out as Underland. What about, where did the Llewellyn Davies boys go? Despite the fact that Barrie said that I put them all in a melting pot and kind of made the character of Peter Pan, many have said that the Llewellyn Davies family's mother, impatient father, and the adorable sons were actually Barrie's models for the Darlings, the Darling family in the work. He even used their names. Mrs. Darling was named after the eldest boy, George Davies. Jack Davies became John Darling. Michael and Nicholas became Michael Nicholas Darling. Peter Davies went to Peter Pan. What of Captain Cook, whose right hand is gone? Well, Barrie suffered paralysis of his right hand from tendinitis. You might recall in the book, the film, whatever you've seen, that the Hook is relentlessly pursued by a crocodile who has swallowed a ticking clock. Is there something in that? Biographers of Barrie say it's a metaphor of Barrie stalked by cruel time, old Father Time. The clock will run down and then he'll get you. There's a line in Peter Pan. The crocodile is both vicious and innocent in its pursuit. Innocent in obeying a natural, inherent impulse, vicious in the narrowness of its goal. Its viciousness is said by some commentators to be the ticking of time in the belly of the crocodile, which seems both to impel the crocodile forward, like the gears of a machine, and to set the terms of the crocodile's eventual satisfaction. The clock is the agent. The crocodile is just an obedient servant. The crocodile with the ticking clock in its belly is more than a metaphor of the march of time, I think anyway, and many other commentators. The crocodile with the ticking clock that impels, the ticking clock, in the belly of the reptile that impels the crocodile forward, is perhaps a clever representation of the outworking of the law of karma. An impersonal, natural law. The law may seem vicious or even cruel at times, but really it's quite innocent in its impartiality. Just as like attracts like, so like produces like. So it is with our thoughts, our words, our deeds. As we sow, so shall we reap. Sometimes almost immediately, sometimes after a long interval. But always sooner or later, like produces like. Theosophy teaches that karma, which means action, that's all it means, is not punishment in any way. If we touch a red hot stove, we'll burn ourselves, burn our finger or hand. But that's not punishment. It's just the natural and inevitable consequence of touching the hot stove. It's reformative, actually. And hopefully after one or two such experiences in childhood, we learn not to touch hot stoves or hot irons. It's often said about a cat that if a cat, a domestic cat I'm talking about, jumps up onto, you know how cats jump up onto the bench? Mine always does, wanting food. We feed it up there so the dog won't get its food, but it just jumps up onto the bench near the sink where we put its food. But, you know, I saw it once jump onto a hot stove, and it's not only will it never jump on a hot stove again, it will never jump on a stove again, whether it's hot or not. That's the difference between them and us. Anyway, that's not an original thought of mine. I don't have any original thoughts. So, the essence of karma is we suffer because there's a lesson to be learnt, and once we learn the lesson, the unlearnt lesson from the past, karma doesn't sort of come back. Once we learn the lesson, the effect stops coming back, so to speak. I haven't really told the story of Peter Pan, but most of you are familiar with it. If you're not, I don't want to tell you too much about the story. But anyway, I just want to deal with the characters. Talking about cats and dogs, there's a dog called Nana. It's a nurse dog. And in Peter Pan, and James M. Barrie had a St. Bernard of his own, Porthos. It seems that Porthos became the dog Nana, who exasperated the stuffy father. But in real life, Barrie wasn't actually exasperated with his dog. And what of the character of Wendy? We talk about Peter Pan and Wendy. Wendy is apparently modelled after the deceased daughter of Barrie's friend, W.E. Henley. Henley, Wendy. The 6-year-old daughter had called Barrie his Fwendy, friend, and from apparently that child word that the daughter of W.E. Henley used for Barrie, Fwendy, Barrie invented the name Wendy. So he said. And at the time, Peter Pan was so popular, Wendy became one of the most popular girls' names for many decades, almost into my era. I remember when I was a kid, this was like in the late 50s, early 60s at school, almost all the girls were Debbies back then. And they say much of it was modelled on the actress Debbie Reynolds. Anyway, it's funny how things go like that and based on people or events or films. Well, Barrie kept revising the play Peter Pan for many years after its debut in publication in 1928. Later the novel came along, and similar characters, similar story. It's interesting that the subtitle to the play is The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. And that really underscores the primary theme, the conflict between the innocence of childhood and the responsibility and obligations of adulthood. Peter Pan literally chose not to make that transition from one to the other. And he went so far as to encourage other kids to do the same thing. Hence that opening line of the novel, all children except one grow up. Barrie's own view to that failure to grow up is in the play and the novel is rather ambivalent. He seems to see on the one hand that it's a good thing. On the other hand, he does seem to see it as quite unrealistic, and there's an element of tragedy in the character of Peter Pan, which many people have failed to see. That in many ways he's quite a tragic figure. He doesn't know how to move on. I want to take a quick look, parting reference really, just a few lines to another famous book, one of my favourite books, Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's got many parallels with J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. In both books we're confronted with the presence of two worlds, a world of childhood fantasy and imagination, and the ordinary, not so happy adult world, which is bound by rules and obligations and imitative behaviour. I think there is a little prince and a Peter Pan in all of us. And it's a child in us, which could be seen as the presence and power of creative imagination that we're talking about here. But the little prince, if you know the story there, he comes to Earth from a little asteroid. He travels from one planet to the other, and each planet is inhabited by some totally self-obsessed me person. The geographer who collects useless information about the planets and the one he lives on in particular. There's the tippler who drinks all the time to forget, but has forgotten why he's trying to forget whatever he's trying to forget. And then there's a king who lords it over everyone, except there's no one on his planet except himself. And a couple of other planets that I can't remember for the moment, but the little prince doesn't find any of these planets appealing, and each one of those is a microcosm, a caricature of us, or various people in our society, us at various times. And eventually the little prince comes to Earth, where he meets a fox who teaches the little prince the only thing that matters. L'essentiel est invisible pour les yeux. And I won't say the rest in French or I'll stumble, but basically he said the fox teaches the little prince it is only with the heart that one can see rightly what is essential is invisible to the eye. And but eventually even that relationship comes to an end of sorts. And so the little prince knows how to move on. And we must do that too. You know, there's interesting in the book and play of Peter Pan, the lost boys. That's what they're called, the lost boys. The boys who fall out of their prams when their nurse is looking the other way. And if they're not claimed in 7 days, they're sent away to the Neverland, where Peter Pan is their captain. But even the lost boys do eventually grow up and have to leave leave Neverland, but not so Peter Pan. He chooses, note that word choose, he chooses to stay in Neverland, notwithstanding that everyone around him chooses to leave. And as I say, Barrie sees something beautiful and this is something sad. The good thing is what the Bible says, the kingdom of God, belongs to children, except you become as a little child. You shall not enter the kingdom of heaven, meaning obviously not, I see, not some place that we're going to go to so much, but a state of consciousness now. Yes, unlike the fox, Peter Pan's incapable of forming a meaningful relationship with anyone. Whilst we find something whimsical and lovely about the character of Peter Pan, particularly when it's presented on stage, and if you've ever seen a television version of Mary Martin who played the role on Broadway, it was an incredible thing. Normally done by a woman, because it's easier for a woman to play a young boy than it is for a man, for fairly obvious reasons. But yeah, Peter Pan's incapable of forming a meaningful relationship, like J.M. Barrie himself, it seems. But Tinkerbell, the Lost Boys, Wendy, they are. I want to read something from the Theosophist William Q. Judge, who was one of the founders of the TS. This comes from his Letters That Have Helped Me. The past. What is it? Nothing. Gone. Dismiss it. You are the past of yourself. Therefore it concerns you not as such. It only concerns you as you now are. In you as you now exist lies all the past. So follow the Hindu maxim, regret nothing, never be sorry, and cut all doubts with the sword of spiritual knowledge. Regret is productive only of error. I care not what I was, or what anyone was. I only look for what I am each moment, for as each moment is, and at once is not, it must follow that if we think of the past, we forget the present. And while we forget, the moment flies by us, making more past. Then regret nothing, not even the greatest follies of your life, for they are gone, and you are to work in the present, which is both past and future at once. And he goes on. Well, that sounds like almost a definition of mindfulness and the art of being mindfully present, and I suppose it is. Nothing that Barrie wouldn't disagree with that, Sir James Barrie, but he seemed to feel that we must never lose sight of this. Adults are not superior to children, not even developmentally. See, most of us in the process of growing up, we lose almost all our creative powers of imagination. And children, you've seen children play, far superior at that and in other respects than we are. I'll go back to The Little Prince for the moment because I think that this could have come out of Peter Pan. Grown-ups never understand anything by themselves, and it is tiresome for children to always, forever be explaining things to them. Only children know what they're looking for. In chapter 1 and chapter 22, respectively, of The Little Prince. Peter Pan talks to us about the power of imagination and the spirit. And here's an interesting quote from Albert Einstein, who made many interesting quotes. Albert Einstein, who was certainly a very intelligent person, said, "The true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination." And what about this quote from Muhammad Ali? I obviously went to the book of quotations on imagination here. "The person who has no imagination has no wings." And that's appropriate for Peter Pan, isn't it? Another theosophist, Muhammad Ali wasn't a theosophist, or Albert Einstein, but anyway, one theosophist by the name of W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats, said this, and he was a theosophist: "People who lean on logic and philosophy and rational exposition end by starving the best part of the mind." Let's never lose sight of that. Well, if you took an aerial view of the play or novel Peter Pan, you'd see two distinct worlds: the ordinary rule-bound adult world and, as I said, the wild magical child world, which is separated apparently by several days flying. It's like 40 days in the Bible. Don't take it literally, it just means an indefinite period of time. And I guess if someone took an aerial view of our own lives, we'd see a similar petitioning. But a closer look would reveal a quite different situation. The adult and child worlds, the ordinary and the magical, the world of the flesh, the world of the spirit, are in very close contact. And in the play and novel Peter Pan, these worlds actually exchange roles, which is represented in the works in a number of ways, including when the Lost Boys and the Native Americans, they call them Indians then, would, in the middle of the night, suddenly change sides. Like kids might change sides in the old Cowboys and Indians game. Which, if Donald Trump had his way, and along with many other politically incorrect things, would come back. Won't get into that, although I did. Then there's Mrs. Darling, who rearranges the children's minds at night. And there are night lights that yawn and sometimes fall asleep, and stars which shout out things. "Now, Peter." A dog that behaves like a lady, and a man who sleeps in a kennel. A dog kennel. These two worlds that I described in various ways are very close. Indeed, they interpenetrate each other right now. It's not so much that there are, I know that some theosophists, and perhaps Orthodox theosophy, would see higher and lower levels of reality. But with respect, and the greatest respect to those that see it differently, I see it more as one order or level. But it's a multifaceted thing within that order or level, with these different worlds interpenetrating each other. But Barrie seems to come to the slightly depressing conclusion that the world of reason and the world of imagination are largely incompatible, indeed irreconcilable. Well, anyone interested in the ancient wisdom knows that there's more to life than what we actually see with our eyes, that there is some unseen world that in many ways is more alive and more real than the visible material world of the senses. Call it the inner life, the life of the spirit, the life of creative imagination and visualization. These two worlds cannot be separated, and they interpenetrate each other. Annie Besant said, "Matter is, in its constituent elements, the same as spirit. Existence is one, however manifold in its phenomena and forms. Life is one, however multiform in its evolution." She also, Madame Blavatsky said, "We see that every external motion, act, gesture, whether voluntary or involuntary, organic or mental, is produced and preceded by internal feeling or emotion, will or volition, thought mind, or imagination. Everything that is, was, and will be, she said, eternally is, even the countless myriad forms which are finite and perishable only in their objective, not in their ideal form. Well, The Wizard of Oz has the Land of Oz and the Emerald City, which, despite its sort of artificial semblance, is actually the real world Bohm would have us believe, not this more colourful world that we're in now, but the more monochrome black and white world. If you've seen the 1939 film, you know what I'm talking about. Went from black and white to colour when they were in Oz, and then back to black and white. But as John Algier has pointed out in many writings and talks, the real, eternal world is the world of black and white, of formlessness and eternality. The world of Neverland was the world that James Barrie created. It seems that Neverland was part of Barrie's emotional survival after the death of his older brother and his unsuccessful marriage. He only had one. It was kind of like an imaginary escape where, when things become too hard to bear in life. But Neverland does, despite its problems in many ways, opens the door to a reality that is both beyond us and within us. As the kingdom, as the Bible says, the kingdom of God is within us, but it's also outside of us and yet to come in its fullness. I mentioned Barrie not being particularly religious. He was born into a rather conservative Calvinist family, which is probably enough to turn most people off religion. He was baptised in what's called the Free Church of Scotland, and pretty dull a lot. But that was the limit of his formal religious connection and involvement. There's no record of him being at all practising Christian religion in his adult life. It seems he lost a lot of faith, if not all faith, in the benevolent God when his brother-in-law, not his brother this time, his brother-in-law died after he was flung from a horse, and Barrie wrote, and what made it worse was this horse was a wedding gift from Barrie himself. So he felt rather guilty about it. And Barrie wrote in his journal about the brother-in-law and his death, knocked out of the world by God while doing his duty, left by his God to die in a ditch. God is love. Note the sarcasm there. But Barrie was a believer in the spiritual faculty of the power of the imagination and the spirit. He said something else about religion which I left out. I'll just mention it here. He said, one's religion is whatever he or she is most interested in. I made that gender neutral. One's religion, whatever person is most interested in. Not a bad religion, really, because religion means to bind back, to bind together, and whatever binds you to your source, to the ground of being, to the creative principle of life, in all its myriad forms, is religion. Although we tend to avoid that word here because theosophy is not in itself a religion. I'll just finish with a couple of quotes, so there'll be some time for some questions if you have any. I want to just give you two more quotes from James M. Barrie's Peter Pan. All the world is made of faith. There's a very religious word or spiritual word. All the world is made of faith and trust and pixie dust. And another one, so come with me where dreams are born and time is never planned. Just think of happy things and your heart will fly on wings forever in Never Never Land. Thank you.
Thank you.